Hello, this is Arielle, the Inconspicuous Bear, and I'll be narrating the 10-man version of the Heroic Thok the Bloodthirsty encounter in the Siege of Orgrimmar from a Guardian point of view. Just a reminder that as with the rest of my Heroic Mode encounter guides, I'm not going to reiterate any of the normal mechanics that are still sticking around, even if they're just like higher damage numbers or whatever. If you need a refresher on those, go ahead and check out the Normal Mode encounter guide, which you will find a link to in the top right hand corner of the screen. It'll stick around for the next 15 or 20 seconds or so you can make sure you have time to click it if you need an updater on those mechanics. Before I start talking about the new mechanics, I just want to make a quick note on this encounter. You can either use one or two tanks. We've always used two because we found the damage intake on the tank is much easier to handle, much more smooth when using two tanks, as opposed to using one tank where the bats come out, things start getting really dicey, and in the ice phase, things are also getting really dicey because of the huge dot that goes in the tank. It's kind of up to you in your raid how you want to handle this. Feel free to do either scenario, depending on what works best for you and your team. Another thing to note about this encounter is that the order in which you open the doors is entirely up to you. We've always gone green, blue, red, however that's not necessarily the way that you have to go. I know some people have gone like red, blue, green, or like blue, green, red or something. Totally do whatever's best for you, but know that everything I say and recommend is going to be based on doing the order green, blue, red. The first new mechanic you'll have to deal with is when you open the first jailer door. For us, it always happens when we open the green door, and after the first acid breath at that point, vampiric K-bats will come out. These bats do a bunch of damage and so on, but all you really need to worry about is if you're the person that's not going to be tanking Thok while the bats are up, then you're tanking the bats, obviously. And you need to make sure that, much like the bats in TOT, you're not going to get a whole bunch of attacks at once. You want to keep Savage Defense up and so on. This is where I would normally use Nature's Vigil combined with Berserk, because you're definitely going to be hitting at least 3 targets pretty much the entire time while the bats are up, which is a huge amount of healing. Even if you are tanking Thok, the Berserk will still chain off of Thok onto the bats, which means you might actually pull a couple of them off, but again, who cares? But you'll still be doing a ton of healing, which will help out you and your raid. If you have Heart of the Wild, you obviously can't use it at this time because you can't rejuve or anything, which is why I prefer Nature's Vigil, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this is definitely where regardless, this is always where you use Berserk to kill as many of the bats as quickly as possible. The second new thing you have to worry about is a big Yeti dude. So you know that Yeti in the trash that charges around the room when you're doing the trash up to Thok? Basically, you get one of those. It's really, really annoying. This happens after you open the second door. For us, it was the ice door. I don't know what's going to be for you. I don't know if it's always the second door. I don't know if it's always the ice door. But after we open the ice door, we get this Yeti, and he charges around the room. You need to make sure that you're paying attention to where he's going to charge next, because you may actually have to move. It's not the damage that's really a big deal. It's 1.2 mil physical damage, which is reduced by armor and all this other crap. So, it's not really going to hurt you, basically at all, but it's the fact that it's going to knock you out of position that's going to cause problems. Especially if it, knocks you sideways, and then suddenly the dinosaur flips and tail swipes the raid. Yeah, it's pretty much GG. So you need to make sure that you're not going to get hit by the Yeti, which is basically the most important part. And if you need to adjust positions so that if the raid has to move behind the boss for some reason or something, that they're not going to get tail swipes, you need to adjust for that reasons. Basically, always keep an eye on the Yeti and adjust your positioning if you absolutely have to, and communicate with your raid when doing so. Tanking items in this encounter pretty much depend on how comfortable you are with it and whether or not you're 1 or 2 tanking. If you're going to be solo tanking this encounter, I definitely recommend using a tanking cloak, because at really high stacks of panic and the fire breath, it can really possible, and the acid breath actually, it's really possible to take a whole bunch of damage at once, which will probably kill you. Whereas if you're going to be 2 tanking it, you are never really going to be in that much of danger of dying, pretty much, at least in my experience. However, if you feel like you are, obviously use the tanking cloak. It really comes down to personal preference. After our first kill, I don't think I've used the tanking cloak since, because we 2 tank it and the DPS is really valuable. So take that for what it's worth. For the metagem, obviously go with the tanking metagem. Obviously, for obvious reasons. I feel like I'm repeating myself at this point. Strangely enough, as it turns out, for an encounter of this difficulty, talents are actually pretty cut and dry. So for your tier 1 talent, you pretty much want to tank Feline Swiftness, because there's nothing to charge. And there's a lot of potential movement where you have to react and move quickly, and the more of a buffer you give yourself with regards to moving out of the way of whatever is happening, the better. obviously for obvious reasons, like say dinos moving through the Great, or say a Yeti comes charging, or say you have to go grab a jailer, or what have you. Any one of those reasons is a very good reason to have feline swiftness, because dying to things you can move out of to avoid is generally looked upon as, bad. Tier 2, I like to go with Ysera's Gift. You could make some arguments for Scenario Ward or Renewal. Renewal not so much, but we could make some arguments for Scenario Ward, especially with the amount of DOT damage, like throwing a Scenario Ward on someone who's kiting Thok while taking acid damage, or something like that. Be pretty good. But I particularly like to just stick with Ysera's Gift. Tier 3, those talents don't matter. Tier 4, Incarnation. Like, this is heroic rating, you pretty much just take Incarnation. Like, especially in progression fights, the DPS increase is very, very noticeable, and it provides you with rage to survive very high burst damage scenarios, of which Thok is one of those. You definitely want to have that rage up when you're tanking at 3 stacks of panic and taking screeches every 1.5 seconds plus melee attacks. Having that rage to dump into frenzied regen is really, really valuable. Tier 5 doesn't really matter. You could make an argument for having the Mighty Bash or Ursula's Vortex for bats or Bash for the jailers, but in my experience I've found that it's better just to let the jailers swing at you and for you to dodge them, because you get more vengeance, and more vengeance means they die faster as opposed to them being stunned. That's just my personal experience. The only real choice comes at Tier 6, whether you pick Heart of the Wild or Nature's Vigil. I actually started with Heart of the Wild when we started progression, because I would have our Paladin throw a bop on me so I could trank, and Heart of the Wild trank's incredibly powerful and easily carries you through 3 or 4 screeches at the tail end of that phase. Whereas you can't trank, obviously, if you're not going to have a bop, and we otherwise would have to use bops on our Elemental Shaman for AG. So once we started 2 tanking, the opportunities to use Tranquility decreased, and I just ended up picking up Nature's Vigil instead for more damage, and Nature's Vigil actually does a ton of healing, because you get up to like 250, 300, 350k vengeance when you're tanking Thok. It's a lot of damage. And all of that off healing, especially when you're dumping rage into frenzy regen, so you're not taking any of that Nature's Vigil healing yourself, it's all going to your raid, helps get them through really high damage phases like having bats up, or late during ice and the physical phase, or during the fire phase when you have burning blood everywhere. Like, having Nature's Vigil available for all of those phases is really good. That's my personal choice. Depending on your raid composition and what cooldowns you have, you may end up having to go with Heart of the Wild. That's totally cool. But again, figure it out with your raid before you make a decision on what talent to take in that tier. As for Guardian-specific things you want to be aware of, the only thing that I found that I needed to specifically actively think about is kind of like a cooldown rotation for tanking Thok and when to use Tranquility. What I do is I start with Barkskin right as I taunted the boss. This usually overlap with a legendary meta gem proc, and once that wore off, immediately go into Rook's Trinket. That's what I started with on progression. I don't use it anymore. I use Harems instead, because I'm never really in danger of dying. But I would go start with Barkskin, and then right into Rook's Talisman, or Rook's Trinket. I don't know. The Rook Trinket, the Trinket for Protectors. And then follow that up with Survival Instincts. And if I was still tanking even after that, follow it up with Might of Ursoc. Or follow up with Might of Ursoc and Barkskin again. And by that time, it'll be a time for a taunt swap anyway. That will reduce a pretty hefty amount of damage, incoming damage to you from like screeches and all various different sources. However, this is my rotations based on the fact that I was tanking second every time, so I would tank second on each of the phases. Sonya would start first, and I would go second. If you're going first, you probably want to hold off before you use any cooldowns, because early in the phases isn't dangerous, like, at all. So you want to make sure that you're managing your cooldowns effectively for those phases. As for Tranquility, if you're not going to be using it as a cooldown during one of the stacking phases, what I would typically use it during is the acid phase, because there's a lot of dot damage going out, and it's possible for people to for your healers to get behind on dispels, which just spirals out of control. And having a tranquility available there allows you to catch up on the healing while your healers focus on just dispelling people. That's what I found personally. As for you, again, like 100% depends on what your raid wants to do and what your raid comp is. So bear that in mind when you're trying to decide, when should I use tranquility and that sort of thing. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and good luck in the Siege of Orgrimmar.
Sorry, Death. There's a tomb right by the thing.
Fires up. Watch the middle, watch the middle. Roy to get in position. Careful of tail swipe and fire everywhere. I want to taunt after 2 stacks this time. Taunted.
Can we just stack now?
Yep.
On his foot, on his heel, on his heel. Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.
All DPS should be on the boss.
Oh fuck, which way?
To the back.
Anywhere.
Just
go. I ran the opposite way, sorry.
It's fine.
Go across.
I'm gonna take him across.
Watch for the Yetis going right through the grate.
Alright, I'm going across like you said.
That's fine. Just keep going.
Yep.
That was the most chaotic killer.
Thank you.
It was beautiful.
But if the